Hey guys, welcome to video number 3 for chapter 33, and for this one we're going to be talking about the scramble for Africa. Now, this section in the textbook actually comes before the European imperialism in the Pacific. I decided to kind of go a little bit out of order here because this is a pretty lengthy topic, the scramble for Africa. You know, it's probably the biggest part of the whole European imperialism. So I decided to kind of just, cut and paste a little bit and put the European imperialism in the Pacific with the other stuff, and then do an entire video dedicated to the scramble for Africa. Africa was the site for the most intense competition among European nations for imperial conquest. The slave trade brought a lot of European involvement in Africa going back to the 15 and 1600s, but as late as 1875, Europeans had conquered actually very little of the continent. They didn't really have the ability to make significant inroads into a huge land that had rugged terrain as well as diseases Europeans couldn't really handle. Industrialization changed that. All right, those innovations that we talked about in video number 1, such as steamships and railroads, that allowed them to travel a lot further into the continent, and also industrial medicine, with technology allowed them to overcome some of those diseases. And with that, they started to make a lot of more expeditions of exploration into Africa. You had European adventurers, guys like Dr. David Livingstone and Henry Morgan Stanley, who was actually American. They did extensive traveling throughout the continent, and it really, kind of brought back these almost, kind of fantasy tales for Europeans. They ate this stuff up of this wild and, dangerous land. It also brought back very detailed accounts of African geography, African people, and most importantly, African resources. Now, the first country to really take advantage of all of this new information was, believe it or not, Belgium, when they created the Congo Free State. Now, the area down here in green, that is the current day nation of the Democratic Republic of Congo, the DRC, which is more or less the entire area of the Congo Free State. This small little speck up here, that's Belgium. All right, so it gives you a sense of the size disparity between the two, of the quote-unquote mother country, how much smaller it was than the actual colony, but it also gave you a sense of what increased industrial technology was able to do for these countries and how much land they were able to conquer. So here you've got the Congo, and here you got Belgium up there. Now, this technically was not owned by the Belgian government. It was owned by the king, King Leopold II. Now you think, how is it possible to be owned by the king but not by the government? Well, it was a technicality, but it was really a personal corporate colony for him. And he used it for the lucrative rubber trade. Rubber at that time was derived from the sap of tropical trees. And so, the Congo River Basin, heavy rainforest, that became a big moneymaker for Leopold. Working conditions in the Congo Free State were unbelievably brutal, and punishments for not making your rubber quota could be beatings, and very often, unfortunately, they were mutilations. And you can see tragically by the children here, and that's another thing to keep in mind, the chopping off of hands. All right, the chopping off of hands almost became a quota system in and of itself that the overseers would use, both as a fear tactic to keep people in line, and also, as I said, almost like a monetary system to make sure, if you didn't meet your rubber quota, well, that would be the compensation for it as well. So really, really some horrible, horrible stuff that was going on in the Congo Free State. Another area in Africa that was highly contested was South Africa. Now, the Dutch were the first Europeans to establish a presence when they founded Cape Town in 1652. Right, so here you have the original Dutch settlers, and as they expanded upwards through the 1700s, this originally was a supply post between the Atlantic and the Indian Oceans, but soon after, as you can see by the expansion here, a lot more Dutch settlers started traveling there. Now, these Dutch settlers were known as Boers or Afrikaners. Boer is Dutch for farmer, and Afrikaner is Dutch for African, obviously. They believed that God had predestined them to claim this land, and more Dutch and German settlers moved there in the 1700s, as you can see from the map, eventually coming into conflict with the native Africans, most notably the Zulus. Britain eventually gains control of Cape Town in 1806 and makes a big move in abolishing slavery in 1833. This led to tremendous amount of resentment among the Afrikaner population, and they eventually migrated northeast from the Cape. They established several independent republics. You can see here. So here you have the Cape of Good Hope, the original Cape Colony, but you've got Transvaal, you've got the Orange Free State, and Natal. This middle gray area, Lesotho, maintained its independence throughout there, as well as this one up here, Swaziland. Excuse me. The British kind of allowed them to do their own thing up until the discovery of diamonds and golds up in those Dutch republics. This led eventually to war between the two, the Boer Wars from 1899 to 1902. And even though it was European versus European, you did have a lot of Africans that were forced into service on both sides. Okay. Eventually, the British would win, and kind of consolidate everything into the Union of South Africa. But they tried to improve relations with Afrikaners by encouraging a system of white European dominance throughout all of South Africa. And this would last into the late 20th century. We'll talk about apartheid later. Now, a bit more about this. I apologize about my voice, guys. By the late 1800s, competition among European nations for Africa had gotten to the point that the rulers said that we got to get together and meet in order to prevent further conflict. This meeting was the Berlin Conference. Delegates from 12 European nations, also the United States, and the Ottoman Empire, they met in Berlin in 1884, off and on from 1884 to 1885, to decide how Africa would be divided. Now, no African delegate was present to give any input whatsoever into the fate of their own land. The conference basically set up rules as how to further colonize Africa. As you can see, as it's dramatized in the political cartoon, they're gathered around and basically dividing up Africa as if it was a cake or a pie. It also kind of created a vision for a mission of civilization, that we discussed in video number 1, the spreading of European civilization, namely culture and Christianity. By the year 1900, there were really only 2 states on the entire continent of Africa that were not under European colonial rule. Okay, you've got them over here. Let me move this down a bit. The gray ones here. So you've got Ethiopia, which resisted Italian takeover in 1895, and Liberia over here, which was founded by freed slaves from the U.S., so it was basically under American protection. Once colonial rule was established, though, Europeans found challenges in figuring out the ideal system of colonial rule. No one model worked due to the tremendous diversity in African geography and culture. Europeans realized that ruling Africa was going to be a lot more expensive than they originally thought also. The original approach to ruling was through these things called concessionary companies. Examples of this are the British East India Company in India or the Congo Free State. They weren't direct representatives of the governments, but they kind of worked on their behalf, and an awful lot of the profit was shared with the parent government as well. These often resulted in very high levels of abuse because of that lack of oversight, and it actually turned out to not be the most profitable as originally hoped. Both the Sepoy Rebellion in India and the public outcry over abuses in the Congo led to imperial rule, which could be either direct or indirect. Now, direct rule was typified by the French. The French government took direct supervision over colonial tax collection, military actions, even implementation of law. Direct rule usually involved eliminating pre-existing political or cultural boundaries in order to weaken old national identities. This was meant to help in the civilizing mission, right? Strip away their old barbaric identity and give them a new civilized European one. Direct rule was effective but difficult because you needed a lot of Europeans on site in Africa in order to maintain control. The British favored an approach of indirect rule. This style used native authorities and laws to their advantage. In areas where there was established African authorities, this could work well, but the British failed to understand just how diverse and complex Africa is. The British ended up imposing random tribal authorities and categories, which in turn led to significant political problems for many African nations when they gained their independence in the 20th century. Still some issues that we're dealing with to this day. All right. So that went over some stuff with the scramble for Africa. And then in the next video, we're going to talk about the emergence of some new imperial powers outside of Europe.